Hello, second grade. Today we are going to be reviewing major and minor a little bit and reading a book about the Beatles. So remember, major songs are happy, triumphant, joyful, sweet, and minor songs are sad, lovely, mysterious. I liked that word when you guys came up with that. Angry and scary. Because your assignment today is going to have to do with major and minor. So we're going to read this book about the Beatles getting to know the world's famous composers. The Beatles, from about 1964 to 1970, were the world's most popular musical group. They were four musicians from Liverpool, England. It was John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. None of them had ever had real music lessons, and they pretty much taught themselves as they went along. So here is the album cover from one of their albums, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band. They are probably the most celebrated rock group ever. In the 1950s, when John, Paul, George, and Ringo were growing up, Liverpool was a poor, gloomy seaport city. One good thing going on there was the local sailors returned home from their journeys and brought back rock and roll from the United States. People who lived in Liverpool became the first people in England to hear this exciting new music. So here's Liverpool in the 1940s. As you can see, even in black and white, it is a very gloomy place. Rock and roll grew out of a bunch of different American musical styles, including country, western, and African American rhythm and blues. Rock and roll had a lot more energy, though, and a wilder sound, and the favorite instruments of rock and roll groups were guitars, drums, and sometimes pianos and saxophones. Long before the Beatles met, each of them was inspired by rock and roll music. They were crazy about singers like Buddy Holly, Bill Haley, and the Comets, Little Richard, the Everly Brothers, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, and especially Elvis Presley. It wasn't just the music itself that John, Paul, Ringo, and George loved. The words of the songs made them feel good, too. Teenagers everywhere thought that rock and roll artists understood them and had the same kind of problems as they did. So here's a picture of all those groups that were mentioned. You have Elvis, Bill Haley and the Comets. You have Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Little Richard in the corner. John Lennon started the Beatles. He was born in 1940 during a World War II bombing. John's father left his family when John was only 5, and his mother felt her son would be better off being raised by his aunt and uncle. That would be her sister or brother. John's mother stayed close while he was growing up, and she helped him get his first guitar. Since Julia, his mother, knew how to play banjo, she was able to teach John how to play the guitar a little. So here's John and a picture of his mom. John Lennon was known as a troublemaker in school. He was always getting into fights and arguments, and John was smart, but he never got very good grades. So here's a picture of all the boys walking across at graduation. It says, "I, for one, will not miss Mr. Lennon one bit," because he was always getting into fights, and there he is. Later, John went to art college. He was talented, but he was much more interested in playing guitar and singing. John and his friends would practice in empty classrooms during lunch and after school. This was the beginning of John Lennon's band, which he called the Quarrymen. Here's a picture of the Quarrymen in 1955. Now let's move on to Paul. So Paul was 2 years younger than John Lennon, and even though music was always around his home, he wasn't interested in music until he became a teenager. Paul's father led a small dance band and played piano. He had also rigged up a set of radio receivers for Paul and his young brother, Mike. Paul heard his first rock and roll songs broadcast from far away as he lay in bed at night. So here's a picture of Paul and his brother and Mike. Paul is the one on the left, right here. When Paul was 14, he started picking out his favorite tunes on the piano. He was pretty good at this, and soon he was anxious to get a guitar. So here's a picture of Paul with his guitar. Once he got his guitar, it seemed like it was all he cared about, and Paul practiced in any room he could find, even the bathroom. Speaking of that, this says, "I thought you were taking a bath." That's Mike. And Mike goes, I can't because Paul's practicing. One day, Paul heard a local band playing at a church picnic, and it happened to be the Quarrymen. Paul thought John Lennon was cool, and he noticed that when John forgot the words, he would just make up his own. Later that day, Paul met John and played guitar for him. Paul imitated some famous rock and roll singers perfectly, and John thought Paul was pretty cool and asked him to join the Quarrymen. All right, now we're going to talk about George. Here's George at the age of 12 playing guitar. George Harrison was born in 1943 and was the youngest Beatle. Of all of the Beatles, he was the one whose parents were most encouraging when he first got a guitar. He started out by teaching himself, and he often became discouraged and almost gave up, but his mother told him he would get better if he kept trying. So here's George and his brother, Pete. George is the one on the right, and here's Pete. By the time George was 14, he could play really well. George happened to go to the same school as Paul, and in fact, George's father drove the bus that took the boys there. George and Paul became good friends, and they practiced their guitars at each other's houses. Paul introduced George to John Lennon, and at first, John thought George was too young and just a kid, and didn't pay attention to him. But George had become good enough to get some jobs playing on his own, and he kept hanging around the Quarrymen, hoping to become a member. One day, George played a song that was one of John's favorites, and John was so impressed that he said George could finally join the band. Now, there were 3 members of the Quarrymen who would become known as the Beatles. And here's the Quarrymen over here. No one's listening to them. And they're like, what's going over here? And he's like, maybe I should be nice and give that kid Harrison a chance. Because there's Harrison. All the girls are watching him. Now, the last member to join the Beatles was their drummer, Ringo Starr. Ringo Starr's real name was Richard Starkey, or is Richard Starkey. He's still alive. He changed his name because it thought it sounded better for someone in show business. That's pretty common. Plus, he always wore lots of rings on his fingers. Ringo had a hard time growing up. He was born in 1940 in one of the roughest, toughest parts of Liverpool. When he was 6 years old, he had a serious attack of appendicitis. Here's a picture of Ringo with an accordion and his mama. Then Ringo had some illnesses that kept him in and out in the hospital until he was 15. He fell behind in school and he had a hard time catching up, and he liked to play with the hospital band, but only if they would let him play the drums. As a teenager, he became even more interested in the drums and bought a set. So here's little Ringo at the hospital, and it goes, oh no, it's the Starkey kid again. And they're going by the headache ward, so obviously you don't want to listen to drums if you've got a headache. Ringo helped start a band for Mostly Fun. Later, he joined a band that became very popular in Liverpool, and Ringo's new band would play in some of the places that John Lennon's band would play, which was now called the Beatles. The Beatles had a drummer, but John and Paul and George weren't very crazy about him because sometimes he just didn't show up. The Beatles would ask Ringo to sit in with them. John, Paul, and George got along great with Ringo and finally asked him to become their regular drummer. So here's Ringo on the drums and George Harrison, and this was before Ringo joined the Beatles. All right, here's a picture of the Beatles. This was before Ringo joined them still. Now, the Beatles had everyone they needed to make a great rock and roll band. John played rhythm guitar, Paul played bass, George played lead, and Ringo played the drums. Just before Ringo joined the Beatles, they had been having some luck playing in small clubs in Liverpool and in Hamburg, Germany. And the thing says, looks like a nice crowd tonight, please pass me chips. Because some of the places they played were dark and dank, and sometimes filled with creepy people. The Beatles had to sing for hours at a time late into the night, and to keep themselves from getting worn out, they would eat and drink right on stage. They often told jokes at each other and yelled rude things at the audience. They were having a great time singing songs they had written and goofing off, and their fans loved it. Suddenly, the Beatles were becoming a big hit around Liverpool. Now what they needed was a way to become better known outside of Liverpool. Luckily, a businessman named Brian Epstein came along at this time. Brian ran a record store down the street from where the Beatles were playing. One day he heard the Beatles and thought, man, they're great. He met with John, Paul, George, and Ringo and told them that he could get their songs recorded by a big record company. He said he would set up concerts and try to get them on the radio and TV. The only thing he asked was them to stop goofing off on stage so much and dress a little neater. Brian Epstein worked as hard as he could to keep his promise, and before they knew it, they were playing their music all over England. They even played for the Queen. Fans loved the way the Beatles shook their floppy hair and their high-pitched famous oohs. Sometimes it caused some of their fans to faint. Alright, here's a picture of the police holding them back while they walked by, and the girls. The cheery "Yeah, yeah, yeah" you can hear in their song "She Loves You" helped to make the Beatles' first million-selling record. The Beatles were more popular than ever in England and the rest of Europe. There was one place, though, where they wanted to become better known. And here's their picture on the stage. And it goes, maybe we should cool it on the ooh part. Yeah, we've got the whole audience this time. And as you can see, the mob screaming fans, and they're all fainted. Because they thought the Beatles were so cute. So, this one says, good news, boys. Tomorrow's your day off. So we're all going to do a concert in Australia, then fly to Switzerland to make a movie, and then drive to London to play for the Queen. John, Paul, George, and Ringo wanted their music to become popular in the U.S., the country where rock and roll began. Brian went to work, and he talked to a famous television show host in America and arranged for the Beatles to appear on his show. This show was called The Ed Sullivan Show. On The Ed Sullivan Show, on that night, it was like everyone in the United States was tuned in. They were a huge hit. The only problem was the fans in the audience screamed so loud with excitement that people could hardly hear them sing, but the Beatles were more popular ever, and they began touring the world. So here's that. This goes with them touring the world. So back then, you couldn't just record something on TV to watch. You actually had to watch it at the time it came on. So like my husband watched Pokemon, and Pokemon, where we were, the new episodes would come on at 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday, and he would get up at 6:30 at 6 on Saturdays and get ready so he could watch the Beatles. Not the Beatles, the Pokemon. Because you couldn't record it. Alright. Traveling ended up becoming a big problem because fans kept screaming so much that they could hardly hear themselves sing, and they had to rush to and from their hotel rooms so they wouldn't get mobbed. Fans were everywhere. Also, traveling to so many cities was making them cranky. So here's the fans. Like, they hit it. Can I have your autograph? Finally, they decided to stop traveling and make records. This is when the Beatles' music started to change. In the recording studio, the Beatles discovered and experimented with new sounds that had never been heard before. They used the recording studio kind of like an electronic instrument and created some of their most exciting music. So here's them going to the recording studio, and it's like, do we have everything? I've got guitars, I've got drums, and he says, I have the recording studio, and it's like the recording studio is on wheels. All right, let's see what else happens. Here's a picture of the Beatles performing Hello, Goodbye. The Beatles started changing and putting echoes on their voices and recording their songs at different speeds. They experimented with music of India and other cultures, and they tried all kinds of different instruments too. They brought in musicians from important symphony orchestras and sometimes recorded things backwards. Their music had a huge influence on many rock composers who came after them. In one of their greatest albums, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you can hear all kinds of wonderful sounds and lyrics they invented. So here's a picture of them with their producer. For the ending of a song called A Day in the Life, the Beatles made a piano chord last 40 seconds. It was spectacular. By the time the band broke up in 1970, many people thought the Beatles had done something no one else had ever done. They had made popular rock and roll music as important as classic or symphonic music. In 1970, when the Beatles split up, it was just so they could go their own way and try their own music. They were all successful. Paul started a group called Wings. George and Ringo recorded their own music and gave concerts, and John wrote music with his wife Yoko Ono. Sadly, John Lennon was killed by a deranged man in 1980. Today, it's easier than ever to hear the Beatles. Their record albums have been re-recorded and are on CDs and on Spotify and on YouTube, and their music is on the radio all the time. So here's the last picture of the Beatles. This picture does not say from when it was, but this was probably around 1970. All right, so I hope you listened when I reviewed Major and Minor at the beginning of this lesson, because your assignment is I'm going to post some Beatles songs, and you guys are going to tell me whether the songs were major or minor. You can just do it in the private comments section on Google Classroom, okay? All right, bye, guys.